When the first waves of German prisoners of war stepped onto American soil, many carried with them heavy dread and grim expectations. They had been told, or at least had assumed, that capture by the United States Army would lead to brutal camps, starvation rations, and degrading conditions meant to break them physically and mentally. For soldiers hardened by Nazi propaganda, the thought of falling into enemy hands conjured images of misery, punishment, and humiliation. As they were herded into trains and buses bound for internment camps spread across the American heartland, nervous glances and whispered speculations passed between them. Some imagined chains and forced marches, others believed they would be thrown into dungeons or left to rot in isolation. The journey itself offered the first clues that their assumptions might be wrong. Guards were stern, but not unnecessarily cruel. They were fed regular meals on the way, meals far larger and more nutritious than many had eaten during the last desperate months of the war in Europe. They noticed the difference almost immediately. Bread came soft and fresh. Meat was included in quantities unthinkable back home, and the portions themselves seemed excessive. While suspicion lingered that such treatment was merely a temporary facade, even hardened prisoners began to wonder if American captivity was truly what they had imagined. Arrival at the camps added another layer of surprise. Instead of barbed wire stretching over desolate mud fields, the POWs found well-constructed barracks, clean facilities, and orderly layouts resembling small villages rather than penal colonies. Some camps had wooden bunks with mattresses, proper heating, and even libraries or recreation fields visible from the transport trucks. The sight alone contradicted every expectation. A few men muttered disbelief. How could a nation at war with Germany offer housing better than what some of their own soldiers had known on the front? For many, this was the first crack in the image of America they had carried with them. Yet suspicion remained. They assumed that punishment might be delayed, or that beneath the surface there would be hidden cruelty. Some whispered that the Americans were fattening them up, only to use them as propaganda pieces or to trade later for their own captured soldiers. Others wondered if this strange treatment was a trick designed to coax information from them. Nevertheless, as the first days passed, reality set in. The guards enforced discipline, but not abuse. The food remained plentiful, and the barracks stayed clean. The prisoners slowly realized they were not being starved, beaten, or stripped of dignity. This shift in perception was profound. Men who had braced themselves for despair found instead an unexpected kind of relief. Letters sent home described conditions in careful terms, often softened by censorship, but still carrying hints that captivity was not the nightmare they had feared. Those who had expected to lose their health or sanity in an enemy camp instead began to see that survival, and perhaps even a semblance of normal life, was possible here. The shock of arrival was only the beginning. What they did not yet know was that American policy toward German prisoners was guided not by revenge, but by international agreements and a deliberate effort to demonstrate humane treatment. Soon, they would discover opportunities unthinkable in any other context of the war, opportunities not only to live decently, but to work, to earn, and even to regain pieces of normal human dignity. The journey from fear to disbelief had only just begun. The first days within the camps revealed an orderliness that unsettled the German prisoners even as it reassured them. They had entered expecting the grim monotony of harsh internment, yet what unfolded before them looked more like an organized community than a prison. The barracks, though basic, were solidly built with wooden walls, raised beds, and enough space to move without feeling suffocated. There were washrooms, mess halls, and in some places even bulletin boards where schedules and notices were pinned, like in a small town. To men who had spent months in foxholes or bombed-out ruins, the neat rows of buildings seemed almost unreal. The food alone was enough to sow disbelief. Meals were regular, served 3 times a day, and though the prisoners were not offered lavish feasts, the portions astonished them. They received bread, potatoes, vegetables, sometimes meat, and coffee or milk. For Germans who had endured the hunger of the collapsing Reich, where even civilians struggled to find sustenance, the camp menu seemed far richer than what many had left behind at home. Some whispered that American generosity could not be trusted, but others began to suspect that this was simply how America functioned, a country with resources so abundant that even enemy soldiers could be fed decently. Daily routines unfolded with a rhythm unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. Each morning began with roll call, followed by cleaning duties in the barracks. The guards were firm but avoided unnecessary shouting or intimidation. Rules were posted, and discipline mattered, but the enforcement was structured, not arbitrary. After chores, the men often found themselves with long stretches of free time. To fill the hours, camps offered books, newspapers, and sometimes even classes. A few of the prisoners, educated in universities before the war, were astonished to discover shelves stocked with literature, both German classics and translated English works. Sports soon became another surprise. Many camps encouraged soccer, volleyball, or even theatrical performances. Some prisoners organized choirs or orchestras using instruments provided or borrowed. In moments like these, the barbed wire fences faded from their minds, and a strange illusion of ordinary life returned. Of course, no one forgot they were captives, but the harshness they expected never came. The ability to gather, to compete in matches, and to play music gave them a sense of being treated as men rather than as mere enemy bodies to be warehoused. Evenings brought more revelations. The lights did not go out abruptly. Instead, prisoners had time to talk, to write letters, and to think. Some wrote to families in Germany, careful with their words but eager to convey that they were safe. Others debated politics, the war, and what would become of them. The camp environment did not erase the reality of defeat, but it softened it, allowing men to reflect without the daily terror of violence. It was within this context of surprising comfort that rumors began to circulate about opportunities beyond idle survival. Whispers spread of work programs, of chances to leave the monotony behind and engage in labor. At first, many doubted the stories. Why would Americans let their enemies work, and what sense would it make to pay them? Yet the rumors persisted, and as days turned to weeks, prisoners came to realize that captivity in America was not about punishment alone. Something else, something unexpected, was taking shape, and soon it would challenge their understanding of what it meant to be both a prisoner and a human being. The turning point for many prisoners came when they were officially introduced to the American work programs. At first, the announcement sounded like some kind of trick, another rumor meant to stir false hope among men confined behind barbed wire. But when officers explained the details, disbelief gave way to astonishment. German prisoners of war were not only permitted to work, but actively encouraged to do so, voluntarily, under humane conditions, and with payment in return. This was unthinkable to men who had been raised in a system where the word prisoner meant degradation, hunger, and punishment. The Americans explained that under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be employed in non-military labor as long as the work was safe and they were compensated. That meant farms, sawmills, construction projects, and even some manufacturing plants far from the front lines. It also meant that prisoners had a choice. They could remain idle inside the camps, living on rations and boredom, or they could step forward to join the work details and find both purpose and privileges. The offer shocked them, not least because it was presented calmly and without coercion. Guards made it clear, no man would be forced to labor. The decision rested with each prisoner. Curiosity soon overcame hesitation. The first groups of volunteers were dispatched to agricultural fields, where American farmers, short on manpower, because so many young men were fighting overseas, greeted them with wary eyes. Yet, within hours, the Germans realized the work was nothing like forced labor. They picked fruit, harvested wheat, or loaded hay bales, often alongside civilians who treated them with surprising normalcy. Some farmers even offered water, shade, or casual conversation, though not without an initial edge of mistrust. The work was hard but honest, and for men accustomed to endless idleness in confinement, it became a kind of relief. Back in the camps, stories of these outings spread quickly. Men returned dusty, tired but strangely content, speaking of open fields, fresh air, and even moments of human connection. For many, the labor revived a sense of dignity. They were no longer merely captives, they were workers, contributing to something tangible. The irony struck them deeply. In the land of their enemy, they found opportunities for meaningful effort that mirrored the rhythms of normal life far more than the chaos of war had. The Americans reinforced the system with order and fairness. Work assignments rotated, ensuring no group felt exploited, and safety measures were enforced. Supervisors made sure the tasks were challenging but not cruel, and when accidents happened, as they inevitably did in farm or factory work, medical care was provided without hesitation. This attention to well-being bewildered the Germans, who could not imagine their own government offering similar treatment to captured Americans. Perhaps most astonishing was the promise that wages would come, not in American dollars handed over freely, but in camp-issued credits or vouchers that could be used in canteens or saved for later. The very idea that their labor would bring tangible rewards overturned every expectation of captivity. Whispers spread in the barracks. Could this really be true? Would the enemy actually pay them to work within his own land? It sounded impossible, yet soon they would see with their own eyes how the system functioned and how it would reshape their experience of imprisonment in ways they had never thought possible. The system of rules and payments unfolded with an orderliness that left the German prisoners both puzzled and impressed. Unlike the imagined cruelty of a vindictive enemy, the Americans presented the work arrangements with clear structure, guided by international agreements rather than arbitrary whim. Each man who volunteered for labor was told that his hours, assignments, and compensation would be carefully recorded. The Americans made it plain, this was not exploitation, but a regulated system where dignity, at least in part, would be preserved. Instead of being handed U.S. currency, which could have encouraged escape attempts or black market trading, the prisoners were issued with camp-specific scrip or coupons. These tokens, often printed on simple paper slips or cardboard, represented their wages and could be spent only within the boundaries of the camp itself. To men who had expected their enemy to strip them of every right, the very notion of being paid at all was staggering. They examined the tokens like strange artifacts, marveling that their labor had value even here, behind barbed wire. The rules governing this system were explained with the same blunt clarity. The work was voluntary. Those who declined would face no punishment beyond the monotony of camp life. Those who accepted were required to follow the orders of supervisors, abide by safety measures, and return to camp at the day's end without resistance. In return, they would earn wages that could be spent on extra food, toiletries, cigarettes, stationery, and even small luxuries like chocolate or magazines. For many, this sounded almost unbelievable. The concept that an enemy power would not only feed them 3 meals a day, but also allow them to buy comforts with earned money, challenged every assumption drilled into them back in Germany. The structure of payment itself became an anchor of routine. Men lined up at designated times to receive their credits, often with slips marked by hours worked or tasks completed. Though the sums were modest, the principle mattered more than the amount. They were treated not as nameless captives, but as individuals whose time and effort carried recognized worth. That recognition left a deep impression on men who had braced themselves for degradation. Of course, suspicion lingered. Some feared that the system was a trick designed to mask hidden control, that the script was meaningless, or that the privileges could be withdrawn without warning. But as the weeks passed, the tokens retained their value, and the camp stores remained stocked. When men realized that the items they purchased truly made life easier, when they tasted the chocolate or lit the cigarettes bought with their wages, the disbelief gave way to cautious acceptance. The Americans understood that this arrangement served more than practical purposes. Allowing prisoners to work and earn restored a degree of morale, reducing unrest and idleness. At the same time, it demonstrated the stark contrast between democratic ideals and the brutal captivity many Allied soldiers had endured in German camps. By adhering to the Geneva Convention with such discipline, the United States sent a quiet but powerful message. This was not merely a war to defeat armies, but also a struggle of values. The German POWs, watching the system function with surprising fairness, began to absorb that message in ways far more profound than propaganda leaflets could achieve. The real astonishment began when selected groups of prisoners discovered they would be permitted to work outside the wire, under guard, but in close contact with American civilians. At first, the idea seemed absurd. These were enemy soldiers, sworn to fight against the United States only weeks or months before. Yet here they were, marching in columns toward nearby farms, construction sites, and factories, not as chained convicts, but as temporary laborers. The barbed wire fences that had defined their captivity were, for hours at a time, left behind. The needs of the American home front explained much of this. With so many young men overseas in uniform, the fields and workshops of the United States lacked hands to plant, harvest, and produce. German POWs filled that void. Farmers who had struggled to keep their crops alive suddenly found themselves supervising groups of former Wehrmacht soldiers. Some of the first encounters were stiff and uneasy. American families watched the Germans arrive with narrowed eyes, uncertain whether to treat them as dangerous foes or merely as workers. But soon, astonishment shifted on both sides. For the prisoners, the shock came in the form of freedom, however limited. They walked in the open countryside, felt the sun without fences overhead, and sometimes worked alongside Americans who spoke to them in plain, human terms. The work was difficult, hauling sacks of grain, chopping wood, tending livestock, but it was dignified and purposeful. Many admitted quietly that they preferred these days of sweat and exhaustion to the idleness of the camp. They returned each evening tired but strangely uplifted, clutching the promise of their earned credits and the memory of hours spent outside the confines of their barracks. The guards maintained vigilance, of course, but the atmosphere remained calm. Escape attempts were rare, not only because of the risks, but because many prisoners saw little reason to flee. To vanish in the vast American countryside, with language and distance working against them, offered no hope of success. Instead, the chance to live days of relative normalcy seemed more appealing than any desperate flight. Some even joked among themselves that in America they had more freedom as prisoners than many civilians did back in Germany under rationing and surveillance. Civilian reactions were mixed, but often softened with time. Farmers learned that the Germans worked hard, followed instructions, and caused little trouble. In some cases, trust grew strong enough that guards loosened their presence, watching from a distance, rather than looming over every task. The sight of enemy soldiers calmly picking fruit or driving farm wagons soon became part of rural life. Children watched with curiosity, sometimes daring to wave, while older neighbors shook their heads in disbelief that war's enemies could be so close, yet so harmless. For the prisoners, these jobs outside the wire carried symbolic weight far greater than the labor itself. Each hour spent working alongside Americans, each coin of scrip earned for their effort, chipped away at the image of a brutal, dehumanizing captivity. Instead, they glimpsed a society so abundant and confident that it could extend trust even to its enemies. This realization unsettled them deeply. Many had believed American propaganda was a lie. Now they were living proof of its truths. The work beyond the fences became not just labor, but a revelation, an experience they would carry long after the war's end. The surprise did not end with the work itself. Once wages began to accumulate, the prisoners discovered another revelation that would have been inconceivable in their expectations of captivity. They could spend the money. Within the camps, small canteens were set up where shelves carried everything from soap and razors to cigarettes, candy, and even pocket-sized books. To men who had marched into the wire with little more than the uniforms on their backs, the sight of these modest shops was almost surreal. They lined up with their scrip in hand, testing whether this strange currency truly carried value. When a bar of chocolate or a tin of tobacco passed into their hands, purchased with tokens they had earned, disbelief turned into quiet wonder. The ability to buy goods transformed camp life. Cigarettes became currency of their own, traded among prisoners, or saved for moments of relaxation. Chocolate, chewing gum, and canned fruit, items that had been rare luxuries in Germany even before the war turned desperate, now appeared within reach. Some men hoarded their scrip, building up savings for later use, while others spent it freely, enjoying the fleeting sensation of choice in a world otherwise defined by confinement. Even the act of deciding whether to save or spend gave them a taste of agency, a reminder that they were not entirely powerless. Beyond the canteens, privileges emerged that further astonished the prisoners. Wages could sometimes be used to buy materials for hobbies, wood for carving, paper and pencils for drawing, even supplies for theater productions staged by the prisoners themselves. In several camps, orchestras and choirs flourished, supported indirectly by the money men earned in the fields and factories. For a soldier who had entered captivity expecting only monotony and despair, the discovery that he could buy a musical instrument or a sketchbook with wages earned on an American farm was nothing short of bewildering. The sense of dignity grew stronger with each purchase. Standing in line at the canteen, choosing items and exchanging their tokens, mirrored civilian life. For men who had once felt like soldiers stripped of all identity, these moments restored fragments of their humanity. They were still captives, surrounded by fences and watched by guards, but they could taste sweetness on their tongues, smell tobacco smoke curling into the air, and write letters home on paper they had bought themselves. The smallest of choices, made with their own earned money, gave them something to cling to in the long months of waiting. The American guards and camp administrators understood the deeper value of this system. By allowing prisoners to exercise responsibility over their own earnings, unrest and resentment diminished. Boredom was replaced with motivation, and idleness with productivity. But for the German soldiers, the effect went beyond camp discipline. It became a quiet challenge to the beliefs instilled in them back home, that Americans were decadent, ruthless, and uncaring. Here, in the very heart of enemy territory, they discovered a system that offered respect to those who had been taught to expect only contempt. The contrast with their fears was so vast that many struggled to explain it even to themselves. Some refused to believe it, muttering that it was all a clever trick. Others, however, felt something shift within them as they pocketed their purchased goods and returned to their barracks. The act of working and being rewarded for that work planted seeds of doubt about the narratives they had once embraced, seeds that, in time, would grow into memories shaping how they spoke of America long after the war had ended. As the months stretched on, the German prisoners found themselves constantly comparing their treatment in the United States to the harsh stories they knew from Europe. For many, the contrast was staggering. Letters smuggled into camp or whispered accounts from repatriated comrades painted grim pictures of how Allied soldiers had fared in German captivity. Accounts of starvation, brutal punishments, forced marches in freezing weather, and endless deprivation filtered into the conversations late at night in the barracks. Men who had once accepted those conditions as inevitable now struggled to reconcile them with the relative comfort of their own lives in America. The shock came not only from the physical differences, but also from the psychological effect of being treated with a measure of respect. Back home, the Nazi regime had drilled into its soldiers the idea that enemies were subhuman, undeserving of dignity. Yet here, in the heart of an enemy nation, they found that the United States allowed them to work, earn money, buy luxuries, and live in conditions that, in some cases, rivaled their pre-war civilian lives. It forced them to ask questions that were uncomfortable and sometimes painful. Had they been deceived about the nature of this enemy? Was the propaganda about American cruelty nothing more than a lie? Some reacted defensively. They insisted that the Americans were merely putting on a show to make prisoners complacent, or that the abundance of food and supplies was evidence of America's decadence, not its morality. They clung to their loyalty to the Reich, unwilling to admit that their worldview had been shaken. Yet others, particularly younger soldiers and those with more education, admitted quietly among themselves that they were witnessing something profound. The sheer scale of American prosperity and the willingness to share even with enemies demonstrated a kind of strength they had never imagined. This realization carried with it a sense of shame. To acknowledge that enemy soldiers lived with greater dignity in American hands than Allied soldiers did in German camps was to confront the cruelty carried out in their own nation's name. Men who had once spoken with pride about Germany's discipline and order now grew silent when confronted with examples of fair treatment in captivity. The memory of Allied prisoners forced to march across Europe with little food, collapsing by the roadside, clashed with their own reality of 3 meals a day, sports fields, and canteen purchases. The conversations in the barracks became charged with these contrasts. Some men debated fiercely, trying to preserve their belief in German superiority, while others simply fell into brooding silence. There were moments when even the most loyal to the Reich admitted that America's system was not only surprising, but humiliating in what it revealed about their own country's failures. The ability to work and earn money, the chance to step outside the wire and engage with civilians, the sheer abundance of food, all of it became evidence that they were dealing with a nation whose strength came not only from military power, but from a completely different vision of society. What lingered most strongly was disbelief. The men could not have imagined before their capture that they would spend captivity discovering such disparities. The shock was not just in the comforts they enjoyed, but in the moral weight of comparison. In being treated with humanity, they were forced to confront how inhumanly their own comrades had treated others. That realization cut deeper than any physical hardship could have, leaving scars of memory they would carry long after their eventual release. By the time the war's final months arrived and the prospect of repatriation loomed, many German prisoners had undergone a quiet transformation. What had begun as disbelief at their unexpected treatment had become something deeper, a reevaluation of everything they thought they knew about America, about war, and even about themselves. The chance to work, to earn money, and to exercise choices within captivity had altered their sense of identity. They were not just soldiers defeated and confined. They had become men again, capable of effort, responsibility, and even small freedoms. Some prisoners had saved their wages carefully, amassing small fortunes in camp scrip or credits that would later be exchanged for actual currency upon their return to Germany. Others had spent freely, savoring every chocolate bar, cigarette, or book they could buy. But the significance went beyond what they owned. It was the experience of being treated as workers instead of chained enemies that left the strongest mark. Years later, many would tell their families that what surprised them most was not the food nor the barracks, but the simple fact that the Americans had trusted them to labor and paid them for it. The long-term impact was most evident in how former prisoners spoke of their captors after the war. When they returned to a shattered Germany, they carried stories of fields harvested under a warm sun, of farmers who offered water and nodded in thanks, of camp canteens where shelves seemed endlessly stocked. These memories contrasted painfully with the ruins of their homeland, where hunger and despair reigned. For some, America became not only the land of an enemy, but also a model of abundance and fairness that lingered in their minds as they rebuilt their lives. Historians would later note how these experiences subtly shaped post-war relations. Many German POWs who had worked in America spoke of the nation with unexpected respect, even admiration. They contrasted the dignity of their captivity with the brutality they knew others had suffered in German camps. In doing so, they spread a narrative that complicated the image of the United States as simply a victorious occupier. Instead, America became for them a place where values of fairness, order, and human decency were lived out even in the midst of global conflict. The lessons were not lost on the prisoners themselves. Men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler's vision of a ruthless struggle for survival now found it difficult to reconcile that ideology with the reality they had lived. In their barracks discussions, many admitted that the war had not only been lost militarily, but morally. The enemy they had been taught to despise had demonstrated a strength of character that contradicted every lie of propaganda. That realization stayed with them as they returned home, quietly shaping the way they spoke to their children and communities about what they had seen. In the end, disbelief turned into memory, vivid recollections of working fields, earning wages, buying goods, and living with dignity behind barbed wire. The paradox of captivity in America was that it offered, to those who had expected only misery, glimpses of freedom in the most unlikely places. And in those glimpses, many German POWs found not just survival, but lessons they would carry for the rest of their lives.